Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this Stretton Institute webinar, Australian Cultural Policy Now, from Quick Fixes to Long-Term Progress. I'm Adam Graycar. I'm the Director of the Stretton Institute at the University of Adelaide, and I'm delighted to share our webinar with you all today and look forward to a productive discussion. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, from which we're broadcasting, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. I'd like to acknowledge their ancestors, their elders, generations past, present, and future, and also to point out that the land upon which we meet was never ceded. What we've got today is a discussion with three eminent people involved in understanding arts and cultural policy. The Stretton Institute at the University of Adelaide has a number of programs, and the Cultural Policy program is our newest program. We started it just a few months ago, and this is our first event, our first outing, and the director of that program is Associate Professor Anna Goldsworthy, who had desperately hoped to be with us today, but is very, very unwell and I think listening to us, but not able to participate, and we hope that she gets much better very, very quickly. The purpose of the discussion today is to facilitate policy directions for the arts and ideally to lay out a policy agenda or help work on a policy agenda. Now, one of the most eminent think tanks in Australia is the Stretton Institute. I don't know, I'm just holding up a report. No, you can't see that report. I'm holding up a report by the Stretton Institute that they put out just recently called the Orange Book. And this is a tremendous piece of policy work. And what it is, as governments, as we're leading into an election, there's going to be a red book for an incoming, if there's an incoming Labor government, a blue book if there's an incoming Liberal government. And they've done an orange book saying these are the big issues that we ought to be dealing with. And they've laid out a whole lot of policy options. So if I look at the table of contents, I'm reading them now, economic policy, housing, energy, climate change, transport, health, aged care, school education, retirement incomes, and on, migration, but no arts, no culture. But then I go to page 2 and they say, look, we couldn't cover everything. We've left out foreign affairs, trade, defence, law and order, agriculture, industrial relations, but no arts. So it didn't even make the policy area, but it didn't even make the left outs as well. So what we want to do today is perhaps, let's start and trace and develop some ideas, not only about where we're going, but about how we're going to get there. And to help us do this, we have three eminent speakers. First of all, there'll be Professor Julian Mayrick, who's at Griffith University. He's an acclaimed director. He's Professor of Creative Arts at Griffith. I heard him on the radio just recently talking about Australian history through 50 plays, I think is correct. Then we've got Professor Justin O'Connor, and he's Professor of Cultural Policy at the University of South Australia and visiting chair in Shanghai as well. And thirdly, Dr. Maggie Tonkin, who less than 24 hours ago agreed to step in because Anna was unwell. And she's based in the Department of English, Creative Writing and Film at the University of Adelaide. And she researches both dance and literary studies, but has also been a member of the Reset Collective. As we go on, we'd like to have as much discussion as we can. So if you've got questions, comments, please place them either in the chat or the Q&A. I'll moderate them. We'll make sure that our speakers will have access to them. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Julian in a moment, then Justin, then Maggie. And then with that, we'll just let it flow, and please have your questions and thoughts and comments ready. Over to you, Julian. We're waiting. Julian, we seem to have lost Julian. Julian did say just a few moments ago that his internet connection was very unstable, and now he's disappeared from our screen. Are you there, Julian? No? Well, this is our first event. Anna's sick, Julian's disappeared. Justin, what if I start with you then? Are you able, without the background that Julian was going to provide, to start to outline some of the issues you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Julian was going to speak a little bit about how we got here in the Australian context, knowing that as he does the kind of policy from going right back to the early days of the Australia Council and beyond. I was really going to jump in and talk about where we are now, what I consider to be a kind of epochal moment.
Looks like we've had another freeze. I wonder, Justin, I'm not sure if you can even hear me, Justin. You've now gone on to mute, Justin.
Yes. So, as I say, we are at an epochal moment, I think, that which I'll say something about in a moment, and yet art and culture are absent from that moment. So let me say, anticipating a little bit what Julian will say, but let me say a little bit about how we got to where we are, because my background in terms of what I've looked at for the last decades, I suppose, since the 90s actually, was around the idea of cultural industries, and then at the end of the 90s they became rebranded as creative industries. And nowadays the kind of shorthand is to say cultural and creative industries, or CCI. And they say cultural and creative industries because, of course, nobody knows what the difference is. So you just stick it in. And one of the things I was saying across Europe, part of my warming up the audience, was who could tell me the difference between the cultural industries and the creative industries? And nobody could, and they still can't. So my concern has been that we've got this idea of cultural and creative industries that nobody really knows what it's about. Nobody can define it. We're still 20 years on, 25 years on from when New Labour invented the term. We're still talking about what's in, what's out. People still talk about mapping. We need to map these industries. This is 2 decades, 2.5 decades on from that first moment of the cultural creative industries. But I don't really want to go into too much detail. I'll go into detail about it in other places. But my real contention is, in part, that the idea of the cultural and creative industries has been a real disaster for the creative sector. And one aspect of that is the reduction of art and culture to its economic impact, its economic consequences in different ways. And this goes right back to the 1980s. You know, we've heard about that when first the arts had to try and justify themselves as taxpayer spend. Well, we're spending all this money, what are you bringing it back? So the idea was very much about, for every dollar that's spent in a theatre, it's spent on there's other dollars spent on car parks and the restaurants and drinks in the lobby and those kind of things. and more wider, more amorphous things about urban branding, etc., etc. We know those stories, and it actually became a kind of a way of trying to redefine art and culture as away from we're just about subsidy, we're the poor relation, we're there, we're there looking for handouts. No, we're not looking for handouts. We are an industry. We are in fact not just an industry, but a cutting edge industry of the future. And this is what interested me really was the idea that cultural creative industries, it's now a pretty mundane economic argument. Everybody's seeing the various statistics that nobody believes, least of all the Treasury. No, the Treasury doesn't believe those statistics. But nevertheless, we trot out these, it's worth so many billion, it employs so many thousand people, etc., etc. But in the 90s, it was really important argument, because what it suggested was that here, as we moved from what we might call a Fordist civilization, an old industrial civilization, into some new post-industrial knowledge-based economy, that somehow culture was central to that epochal change. It was central to it. It was part of what we were. And for those of you around in the 90s, the idea of cultural industries, creative cities, a bit later, creative class, that creativity went from something that artists did and was all very interesting and very nice to something absolutely crucial for workforces. It was what was going to permeate the whole economy, what was going to lead industrial countries. Now that Asia mostly was doing all the metal bashing, we would now be design capital, we would be about intellectual property, all those kind of things. And art and culture was central in there, as we all know from the various argumentations. So really fast forwarding, we're now at a place where nobody really takes any notice of that. And as I say, Adam had just mentioned its absence from the Stretton Institute. It's absent from the Labour Party's lecture manifesto. If you've seen that, it's a very long document. The national, I forgot the full title, but it's about 220 pages. Art and culture gets about a page. The Greens, there was a very nice article by Laura and Child Harris yesterday in the Kill My Darlings, and she makes a point. The Greens probably better than the National Labour on this, but still, it's a minimal and it's a marginal kind of aspect of any policy. So how have we gone from culture as being the key to the transformation from industrial to post-industrial to wherever we are now, that art and culture is a marginal concern? And this is true more globally. I mentioned about a European. I've just come back from Europe after 2 months and spoken to a lot of people on the mainland Europe, as we have to say now, and in the UK. And it's quite clear that they're feeling increasingly frustrated about their positioning. Of course, a country like Germany, lots of money in to support art and culture in the pandemic, and France as well. It comes and goes with the different countries. But what's clear is that what happened in the pandemic, and I won't go through that here. What's happened in the pandemic is a real kind of it was a tipping point around a situation that had been building up for a long time, which was the marginalisation of arts and cultural policy within public policy, and of course the gradual decline of arts and cultural workforce. Some of you might know Thomas Piketty's recent work on capital and ideology, and an often quoted chapter within that talks about Brahmins and merchants and Brahmins. And one of the key findings for him is that social democratic parties have abandoned the working class. They've abandoned the industrial working class, the blue collars, and have become a party captured by the professional managerial class. And that you can see echoes of that. That's actually an argument. Thomas Piketty is a socialist, but it's an argument that's been picked up by the right more generally and said, see, there we go. art's about elitism. But you have a look at that professional managerial class, and you look at artists. I would say artists have dropped out of that class significantly in the last 2 decades and over the last decade. To call an artist somehow a professional managerial, as they're often classed statistically, when you look at what their annual income is, we've seen, David Throsby has been doing this for years. It's a pitiful income, pitiful. Some artists on $5,000-6,000 a year. So the idea of the idea that we would fund the arts to provide cultural jobs is a laugh now. We don't. We provide projects, and artists are expected to do freelance. The only people making money in the arts sector, apart from the tip of the iceberg, the international successful performers and artists, the only people making money are the administrators, those actually in those full-time jobs. So we're in a really dire situation, and it's clear that the whole cultural industries thing has actually made it worse. Our only way we can talk about the art and culture is as an industry. I mean, how on earth did we get ourselves into that position? And what do industries do? They create profits, they grow, etc., etc. This industry is not growing. This industry is not creating profits. And if it is, they're not recouped by the arts and cultural sector. So there's a real sense, and I found this right across Europe, of we need to change this moment. Now, what's interesting for me, and what's interesting for me is that these are the ideas around a new kind of social economic policy, if you like, have been growing since the global financial crisis. That somehow the system of capitalism or neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, is not working, and we need to radically transform. Of course, that's driven by climate change. It's driven by growing inequality, and you don't need me to talk about those. Those are facts, really, that are generally accepted outside the coalition party usually. But these are generally accepted facts. How are we going to transition from where we are now to a climate safe polity, and how are we going to do that whilst not exacerbating and in fact hopefully reducing inequality? I mean, they're two very basic things. And so we've got this shift towards more state-led investment in green jobs, in infrastructure, in social services. These are the things that are going to provide the jobs. Not a new industrial strategy, but around social services, infrastructure, sustainable kind of technologies. These are the arguments being made. They may be made in America around the Green New Deal, and in Europe, Next Generation EU, even in China, they're looking at these kind of things. The World Bank are arguing for these things. Read Joseph Stiglitz and people like that. The International Monetary Fund, and KPMG are pushing the idea we need to move to services. There's a whole shift to this idea of a move to public value, state-led investment, infrastructural development. And where's art and culture? High-tech, entrepreneurial, industry development, right back in the 1990s. And quite frankly, I find it embarrassing to sit there with people who don't really know what they're talking about, talking an economic development model that nobody believes in anymore. Talk to economists, they would laugh you out of the door, but there we are, dutifully talking about how we're going to create this jobs and drive investment, etc. So my concern was first that we need to move out of that. We need to align ourselves with a new kind of political, economic, social development thinking, of which arts and culture should embrace. We should see ourselves not as part of a high-tech, high-growth, high-productive industry, but as a part of the health, education, social services, infrastructure, what I call, and what we in Reset call the social foundations. This is where the future lies. And it's about shifting art and culture back to art and culture as part of public policy. Doesn't mean it's all completely subsidized by any means. It's always going to be a mixed economy, and a very, very complicated one, to be honest. But just as education is an industry in many respects, it's a big economic lump, so too health, all these things have jobs, they have investment, but we still talk about them as public policy. Hopefully, we'd still look to education as doing something in terms of public policy, not for how many jobs it creates, although, it's touch and go on that. But art and culture constantly talks about what jobs are they bringing. We must invest in arts and culture because they are worth so much and they employ so many people. We need to break out of that. And it's the cultural sector that needs to do that. And I would say, just finally, I want to wrap up now, but finally, I think art and culture's responsibility to do that is crucial, because not just for its own survival, because if it doesn't do that, it's going to sink without trace. Make no mistake about it. But if for its own survival, but also as a contribution to the transition that's going to be made, because as Adam just mentioned in terms of the orange booklet, so many of these transformative agendas do not mention culture, even though it screams off the page that clearly they're talking about culture. But the donut economy, Mariana Mazzucato, the Green New Deal, all these things do not talk about art and culture. Whereas in previous transitions, maybe going back to the 1930s with the shift to New Deal and social democratic economics, and in the 90s, as I say, the shift towards a kind of a post-industrial thing, art and culture were there. Why are they not there in this transition? And I would say our job really is to start thinking along those lines. And it means getting rid of a lot of our language. It means getting rid of a lot of our emotional investment in all these ideas of entrepreneurialism and startups and these things. But also universities, getting rid of our attachment to cultural and creative industry masters programs. I've set up about 3 of those, and we have cultural and creative industries research institutes, etc., etc. It's going to be a hard job, but unless we do it, art and culture will disappear into the margins, as it has been doing for the last decade or so. So that's my pitch on that one. And now upside down, I can see Julian's come back online. So I'll kind of pass it over to Julian, if I may, in that way.
Thanks so much, Justin.
Now, I want to interrupt and say that Julian has an unstable internet connection. And so if he disappears, we'll all bear with it, and we'll persevere.
Thank you, Adam. I've got COVID, so I'm still in isolation, and I do sound a bit froggy, and I have to keep my vocal cords covered in liquid, which is why I'm drinking tea all the time. I was also supposed to set up Justin, and so this is going to be a bit weird, but I'm going to cover the history, and because my head is full of wool, I've written it out. So this is a park and bark. I'm going to stand and deliver, and then we can see how that fits in with what Justin has said and what Maggie will say next. So my job is to offer some general remarks on Australian cultural policy, both as it existed in the past and now, and to identify some of the regular problems, the hardy perennials that beset this domain, and then Justin and Maggie can fit into that. So I've been writing about cultural policy for nearly 3 decades, and mostly in the register that I learnt when I was a politics and economics student. When I consider the processes, relations, and documents of cultural policy making, I see them as part of a larger web of public administration and service provision. I draw on concepts I absorbed back in the 1980s, like Herbert Simon's bounded rationality, Mancur Olson's free rider, Max Weber's monocratic bureaucracy, Robert Dahl's distinction between power, influence, and authority. So despite my life as a professional theatre director, I don't peg culture as a policy unicorn, an area entirely distinct from policy making in general. I don't mean that art and culture are like any other good and service. I mean that the administrative and political problems with which they are entangled are best viewed as part of a larger crisis affecting many areas of public policy and bound up with the ascendancy in the last 50 years of what Michael Pusey called economic rationalism, and is more commonly, if less precisely termed, neoliberalism. That ascendancy is now over, but the background radiation that accompanied it is still potent. there is as yet no widely accepted alternative model with which to replace it. This too impacts on cultural policy, making it a local symptom of a global disease. So rather than berating governments for their lack of understanding and support for cultural activities and institutions, and reducing the policy dialogue down to a small number of richly repeated claims and proofs, it is important for the cultural sector to grasp the bigger picture they are a part of, and to comprehend it in its own terms, and not just object that these terms are misrepresentative of what it does. They are, I know it, but seeing the problem as a moral failing susceptible to an increase in targeted lobbying, i.e. pressing the claim, and the accumulation of conventional evidence, i.e. upping the proof, does nothing to unpick the policy logic that has wrapped around Australian arts and culture like a strangling weed since the late 1970s. This is what the sector needs to do now and next. There is no change in the situation without first understanding it. So in respect of the history of Australian cultural policy, we can identify a number of policy dynamics. From federation in 1901 to the 1920s, the criterion for funding was individual artistic achievement, and the main federal agency involved was the Commonwealth Literary Fund. Frank Morehouse has written about the importance of Vernon Knowles in the 1930s. A young novelist the CLF chose to support not for work he had already completed, but for work he had yet to do. The policy dynamic shifted from rewarding creative achievement to supporting creative potential. In the 1940s, when the idea of a National Cultural Council was first being considered by a Labour government at the behest of H.C. Nugget Coombs, these two dynamics, which coexisted, were transposed into a collective register. The focus on cultural policy shifted from the individual to the community, to the idea of universal cultural provision. The National Theatre Movement was the key institution, which represented an influential alliance of performing arts organisations. Though neither a cultural council nor a national theatre eventuated, the principle of supporting democratic culture survived the transition into the Menzies years and found its way into the charter of the Australian Elizabethan Theatre Trust, established in 1954. It was not truly national in scope, however, as it was financed by individual states. It gave way in 1968 to the Australian Council for the Arts. A cultural democracy policy dynamic, emerged in the Whitlam years, when the arts budget was significantly increased and the Australia Council was established as an independent statutory authority. The difference between democratic culture and cultural democracy is the difference between a policy focused on existing industrial distinctions, with professional artists providing art and audiences consuming it, and one that treats these distinctions more fluidly and sees creative activity as a right everyone has to engage in, regardless of whether they are professional artists or not. Again, the two dynamics coexisted through the rest of the 1970s and the 1980s, and they expressed themselves in different priorities. A concern with universal cultural provision led to funding criteria around regional diffusion, gender and background of artists, and touring. A concern with cultural rights developed into the community arts movement and programs such as Art and Working Life and Youth Arts. For anyone who wonders why Australian cultural policy is so conflictual, despite the comparatively small amounts of money involved, it is for this reason. The different policy dynamics have coexisted without resolving into a holistic view of art and culture. By the time we get to Creative Nation in 1994, all four funding criteria are detectable: creative achievement, creative potential, universal cultural provision, and cultural rights. It is not impossible to align them, and the concerns each reflect haven't gone away. Discussion today about a UBI, the digital divide, and the accessibility of traditional art forms like opera and concert music are undersprung by these policy dynamics, even if the words we use to engage the issues differ from those of 30 years ago. But that isn't the main problem Australian cultural policy faces right now. From the late 1980s onwards, another kind of policy dynamic can be discerned, which is best thought of as an anti-dynamic, a force that attempts to undo the thinking of certainly the Whitlam government, but quite possibly the Menzies years as well. Like a virus, it attacks and hollows out the different criteria that have been successively developed to inform and shape public assistance to the cultural sector. It is driven by neoliberal economics, but it is not confined to an economic analysis. It includes a raft of assumptions about reducing government budgets, increasing executive power, the sovereignty of individual consumers, the desirability of market structures, and the primacy of Pareto efficiency as the main guide to resource allocation. Michael Pusey's 1991 book, Economic Rationalism in Canberra, is still the best account of the transformation that swept across all areas of policymaking under Hawke and Keating, enshrining Treasury, Finance, and the Prime Minister's office as the sources of ultimate decision-making in government, and downgrading the service departments, which would include, but by no means be confined to, the Office of the Arts and the Australia Council. The economic rationalism that Pusey describes bears similarity to cult thinking. It is a closed policy logic that alters its surface terms, points of address, and methods of evaluation without acknowledging and justifying, let alone changing, the hallmark assumptions that animate its logic. As a historian, I am particularly interested in the churn of personnel between the senior executive service, the Productivity Commission, the big four consultancy firms, and arts boards. I have done some, but not enough research into an employment conveyor belt that brings into existence the cadre of disciplined believers necessary to uphold economic rationalism as a policy logic, especially now when its assumptions no longer meaningfully reflect the problems Australia faces. A good theatre play requires both a script and a good cast. The script of neoliberalism stopped making sense in 2007 with the global financial crisis. Since then, it has relied on the acting skills of its adherents to stave off intellectual collapse. The COVID pandemic has tested those skills further, but it is still not clear what kind of theatre play would replace it if we were to yank neoliberalism off the policy stage. It is important for those in the cultural sector to realise that what oppresses them and prevents the proper policy dialogue about art and culture in all its manifestations is not a bunch of pantomime villains, but a system of thought. Changing an arts budget without changing the policy dynamic behind it changes less than we hope. When facing an anti-dynamic, like neoliberalism's raft of ungrounded and unrealistic assumptions, it is all the more important to have proper conceptual resources to match bad thinking with good thinking and to deploy the political strength of the sector where it matters most. For example, treating those who work in the Australia Council and the Office of the Arts as potentially important players in the search for a new policy dynamic is the correct approach. Politicians come and go. Bureaucrats stick around. It is the administrative environment of cultural policy making that needs to be changed, not just the minds of a few ministers. Cultural practitioners have fallen into the trap of thinking that both the Australia Council and the Office for the Arts are merely delivery mechanisms for funding, whereas they are important battlegrounds for the development of new cultural policy ideas in the post-neoliberal era. And until those ideas are developed, there won't be a post-neoliberal area. So if I run out of time now, Adam, is that me? You're on mute, darling.
No, you haven't run out of time, and what you're saying is very interesting.
Great. Well, I've got about a page more to go, so if people stick around for that, then I'll. So to finish off, I'm going to quote from some notes I made for the Adelaide Research Group after I'd attended a forum on Australian cultural policy's history and present crisis. So calling it a crisis coming out of COVID is not hyperbole. The federal government's claim that the sector has been well supported during the pandemic should be set aside. It has on a number of occasions proved itself to be an untrustworthy communicator of the true state of a number of policy areas. So we're at a moment in neoliberalism's narrative when its political needs have parted company from its empirical methods. And no amount of numerical data will shift government's views unless and until the assumptions behind those views are brought into light and subject to clear, scrupulous and thorough critique. So here are 6 things that I think are stopping the cultural sector from having a better dialogue with the policy process. I'll just run through them. First, and I'm thinking mainly of people in the cultural sector, we don't know the policy record well enough. Too often we speak in ignorance of the history of cultural policy, unaware of how significant documents and events have affected the arguments we're making. If we do acknowledge them, the context is not acknowledged, so there's a flattening of historical perspective, as if the past was an extension of the present. Secondly, we don't generalize in a persuasive way. So there's often good awareness of the conditions under which we as individuals create our culture, but our generalizing isn't convincing because it's obvious that the working conditions of Australian film, say, are different from those in the performing arts. So the work of analysing the sector and identifying where the real structural affinities are isn't being done. Thirdly, broader historical events and social changes are rarely mentioned, and research in other disciplines is rarely cited when arguing for and about culture. And I've mentioned a few of those, but they include the deindustrialization of the 1980s, the weakening of legislative oversight, the dominance of Treasury across government areas, the ongoing jurisdictional struggle between federal and state governments, and the multiplication of think tanks that has weakened the public service as a source of policy advice. So the discussion panels that I attend on arts and culture usually don't have anybody on them who isn't from the sector, so there isn't a chance to discuss those kind of wider issues. Fourthly, we often muddle discussion about the effects of culture with debate about the institutions supporting it, failing to appreciate that they're entirely separate issues. So there's an eagerness to associate art and culture with the beneficial effects they have in broader social life, but that can often have an opportunistic feel to it. For example, in the 1980s, with Australia aspiring to be the clever country, culture was allied to educational benefits. In the 1990s, creativity was linked with innovative thinking, and now art and culture are being positioned in terms of well-being. So these benefits may be real, but the choice of one or another is driven by an external political agenda of which those in the sector often seem unaware. And finally, there is not enough discussion about the inherent nature and substantive value of art and culture. So few make the case for culture as a mode of inquiry, yet we know very well that culture is a profound way of being in and learning about the world. As acknowledgement of First Nations history and culture shows, cultural practitioners well understand the connection between the search for new knowledge and creative practice. Culture as a meaningful vehicle for inquiry, though, is something about which informally you can talk to anyone in the sector. However, such overarching arguments are rarely made in public in a sophisticated way. Instrumental outcomes are emphasized. The what and why of culture is neglected, the place and value of culture in our lives. It is not possible to conduct a high-level policy discussion about art and culture without dealing with these aspects of their appearance. They don't have to eat up the whole policy debate, but a better way of articulating them must be found. So there you go. I'm sorry, Justin, that was supposed to be a handball to you.
Well, there we go. We can blend the two together, and thank you very much, Julian. I'm glad I didn't act as an authoritarian chairman and cut you off before those 6 points, but they were very valuable. Let's hand over now to Maggie, and that'll set the scene for a discussion. So over to you, Maggie.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you both, Justin and Julian, for really a fantastic and informative setting up of a discussion for the audience, hopefully. I mean, having stepped in quite late into the picture, I think I'm partly going to be just summarising some of what I see as the 2 key points that have come out of what you've said. And And those are that, about timeliness, really. One is that we are in this immediate position of crisis that has been precipitated partly by COVID, but is of long generation. This has just kind of tipped the sector over the edge, but this has been coming for a long time as a result of, neoliberalist ideology and a sort of failure of cultural policy. So there's this immediate crisis, but there's also the issue of the long term. How do we value arts and culture? And what kind of society do we want to live in? How does it fit within that society? So, if we think about the immediate situation, the recent cuts to the arts and culture funding within the 2023 budget, just a week or two ago, has kind of been reported in the arts press and minimally in the kind of broader press, but really it hasn't got the airtime that it deserves. When we think the spending cut goes from 990 million in 21-22 to 799 million in the subsequent year. So that's almost $200 million cut to an already small area of funding. So a massive cut. And cultural development funding is also going to fall. There are specific cuts to funding for things like Screen Australia and also the national institutions, particularly the National Library of Australia, which is our, an absolutely key site for the preservation and archiving of culture in Australia. There's a really significant cut in funding in that. And music also is going to face a 20% cut. So, arts industry bodies are jumping up and down about this, but it doesn't seem to have got traction in the press. And, it's like the Stretton Institute. It's as if art and culture just don't really figure as part of even the kind of economy, let alone thinking of them in terms of value. So, in South Australia, we've had this recent state election and with a new government installed, and there's obviously an imminent federal election, and this is an opportunity, hopefully, for changing the conversation at a political level. But, as you were saying, Julian, ministers come and go. Bureaucrats are really perhaps the ones we should be trying to engage in thinking about how can we change thinking to a long-term kind of thinking about the value of culture. So there's a moment of opportunity here, and obviously in the election campaign we've got the Fund the Arts campaign going, which is trying to draw attention to this. We've got also candidates like Joe Dwyer standing in Boothby, who's an arts producer and director, and wanting to draw attention to these things. So there are numerous kind of people out there and campaigns out there with an agenda. The recent Australia Institute report, Creativity in Crisis, authored by Ben Eltham and Alison Pennington, made, I think, 10 recommendations about immediate things that could be done. And some of those are relatively low cost, like mandating higher levels of Australian content across streaming platforms. They also had more contentious things like imposing a levy on reused content, that kind of thing. But also something like just better coordination of policy between the local, federal and state is presumably a relatively cost-neutral change that could have far-reaching effects on the sector. One of the most egregious things that we've seen in the university sector as well as the arts sector is ministerial intervention in funding decisions. So the RISE fund, which was the recovery from COVID kind of fund, has really not quite been on the same par as the Brandis interventions, but necessarily, but is also a worrying sign of walking away from that arm's length peer-reviewed funding model, which has always been intrinsic to the Australia Council. So, there are many things that hopefully could be addressed in the short term that would really help to support and rejuvenate the sector. But in the long term, you know, a lot of our thinking has to be about the nature of work going into the future. You know, that's with automation really creeping on relentlessly, a reevaluation of arts and culture is a central platform really for thinking about the kinds of society that we want to live in. You know, Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about everyone having a right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts and share in scientific advancement and its benefits. It's difficult to know what this really means in practice. If we think about the changing nature of work, there's no certainty that it's going to improve our lives. You know, automation could be for the greater good, and we could have greater leisure time to pursue arts and culture and other leisure activities. But on the other hand, and this is really cutting across all sectors, but very pertinent to arts and culture, that the relentless rise of the gig economy and casualisation, you know, might mean that we all have 3 part-time jobs and no leisure whatsoever to enjoy anything, let alone arts and culture. So, you know, I think the argument that Justin has advanced about rethinking about how arts and culture fit within our understanding of the economy and the nature of work is incredibly crucial. And, you know, one of the ideas that has come up through a lot of economic thinking is that, you know, the economy is a choice. It's not a God-given. The economy can be reconfigured, and there's a lot of work which we've been exploring in the Reset Collective about different economic models that would situate arts and culture differently. And some of them don't, you know, just as we've already spoken about, some of them don't actually directly address arts and culture at all. And that omission is really glaring when they are trying to rethink the kind of social fabric and the economic fabric. So it's kind of our job to try and reinsert arts and culture into all of those economic discussions as absolutely intrinsic parts of the economy. So, I mean, in the long term, we need to think about how to revalue and rejuvenate arts education as well if we are truly going to be able to participate in a cultural life, as the UN Declaration declares. Things like, you know, community arts centres are really critical, I think. You know, these can enrich communities as well as individuals. And we also, I think, need to really think about the relationship between the arts and culture and democracy. You know, that's a really critical discussion. We know historically how in autocracies and dictatorships how arts and culture have been managed and you know, suppressed to some extent, or you know, certain socialist realism, etc., has been mandated. So just to sum up, I think, you know, First Nations people really understand that culture is the bedrock of their survival, that's the centre of their lives. And I think we need to rethink culture in that same way as absolutely vital to human flourishing, that we just, without culture, you know, life is very drab indeed. We don't live by bread alone. So I think there are many avenues for thinking about this. I would have liked, Justin, for you to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I wonder if you could speak about that in the Q&A and how culture has been left out of those. So I might hand over to you, Adam, to manage the questions.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and thanks to all 3 of our speakers. I'd like people who are on the webinar, if you have a comment, if you have a question, whether it's a question to a specific speaker, or whether it's a general question or even a general comment, please place it either in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll monitor it. What we've heard is a very, very interesting analysis of where we've come from. We've come to understand the deficiencies and the problems. And I think it's really important for us and for the Stretton Institute to be able to work out where we go from here. Now, part of where we go is understanding where we've come from, but we also to understand where we want to go. And so our role is really to try and assist in laying out a public agenda. But one of the important things in understanding any sort of policy is where's the intervention point and where's sort of the ownership. You know, when we're talking about the arts, you know, are we talking about this as a main function for government, or is it something that the market should determine in terms of what's delivered? Or is it something that individuals and families just do on their own, or do we look to philanthropists to do it? Or how do we even orchestrate that whole activity? Another thing, interestingly, you know, when I looked at the Stretton Institute document, it was really focused on the federal government, and and the deficiencies were there. It just wasn't there. But what we do know, and as Maggie was just saying, we were talking about community arts and so on, should there be a national agenda for the arts, or is arts essentially very, very local? You know, is it national? Is it local? How do we find, you know, where do we get the best intervention if we go either national or local? And Julian certainly laid out the whole structure of what happened nationally, and in some ways, you know, people shrieking, but nobody listening. When I turned to the Stretton Institute, as I said, Anna Goldsworthy, who's not able to be with us today, but is listening, I think, is starting to deal with music education. And this is one way forward. Anna and her colleagues in the Elder Conservatorium are starting to look at using music as one policy. There are certain policy thrusts in music, and music's very, very important. During the lockdowns, music brought a huge amount of comfort to a lot of people. It was what kept them going. It gave them a great deal of inspiration. And just the other night, watching the news and watching the dreadful things happening in Ukraine, in the subway in Kharkiv, people were huddled there, away from the bombs, hidden way underground. And what did we see? We saw a violinist, you know, starting to play, and the people huddled in their blankets were just enraptured, and the comfort that that brought. Now, you know, there's no money in that, there's no industry, there's no job. And what Anna and her team have started to look at are really the whole process of nurturing the ecosystem in music education. And then when we can sort some of that, we can see whether that is transferable elsewhere. You know, there are huge cognitive effects through studying music. There are practical skills, there are human development skills, and there's the whole process also of nurturing future audiences. People who are, if for the economic rationalists, going to be consumers of the product, but for the people in Ukraine, for the people who are locked down, people who can get comfort from the culture itself and see it as intrinsic and valuable in its own right. Now, you know, I might just throw a question back to people on the panel. Is cultural policy a national issue, or is it essentially a local thing? How might people on the panel deal with those issues?
Do you want to take that one, Justin, or do you want?
Go on, Julian, you can speak to that.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Well, you can't ask it in that way, Adam. It has to be in some way folded back onto Australia's history as a nation, which is a peculiar one. Sometimes it acts as a national unit, and sometimes it acts like a bunch of states. So it's a bit like those kind of atomic particles that sometimes come in waves and sometimes come in dots. So its jurisdictional lines, the way in which it operates and decides things is not clear. In fact, I think it's even bewildering to the people who are in it. It is, however, to some extent a three-cornered triangle with state governments, local governments, and national governments all occupying different parts of the ring. And I think probably there's a need to build an alliance between them. It isn't necessary to develop complete consistency, but there is a need to share principles and a sense of mission. So I think the answer to your question, having rudely dismissed it at the beginning, but bringing it back now in new clothes, is that you do both. You converse with each level of government, trying to construct something like shared understanding between them, knowing that the federal government has been reducing its support for arts and culture over the last 20 years, but local governments have been increasing it. So they're important players, will continue to be important players into the future.
Thanks, Julian. Justin, do you want to comment on that? Or we've got a few other questions as well. So,
just to say, it's got to be both. I mean, I know it's an obvious answer, but it's got to be both. There are certain things that require national legislation, and of course, a cultural policy has to have some kind of national, or whatever the collective is, national affiliation. But it also has to be regional. I've just seen Amy's comment there. It's also got to be about that local level. But however they're connected to each other, they also, as we've said, it's also got to be about what's at stake here in the culture, and that's the question that's got to be asked before we get to local and global, how they local and regional and national, and how they interconnect in different ways.
Yep. Well, Justin mentioned Amy's comment. Amy's put a comment saying, I'm seeing a lot of great initiatives in regional areas of Australia. There's a great social enterprise model building out in East Gippsland with Float, School of Tourism, fantastic at engaging local artists in sustainable community collaboration. And Amy also gave us the website there. It's made me much more interested in conversations involving regional arts and grassroots models of sustainability.
Yeah.
And we'll put that up on our website.
Yeah, that's where a little history can be helpful, because the last period of big resurgence in the regions with regional art that I know of was in the mid to late 70s and into the 80s. And then the national government of Australia then killed it off. So there were a lot of local government, state government initiatives, and then a series of federal government decisions that closed it down. So that I take that as a classic Australian policy misalignment, where one level of government is doing one thing and another level of government is determined to destroy it. And that's got to stop.
Yeah, and this is one of the hardest issues in our federation. Anne Pender has a question. She's saying, would you care to expand on the idea of how we might recognise and utilise structural affinities in this battle? So, Julian, why don't you kick off and then we'll ask.
Well, I use that. Yeah. So it's really to do with how, the cultural sector is very diverse. And in fact, according to the government, includes footwear. So let's leave that one out and kind of go, no, that's just a piece of junk that the government used to inflate their figures, and look at, who might be in the sector. But even if once you've done that, once you've got rid of, shoe shops and so forth, handbags, it's still pretty diverse. And usually people are locked into a little micro suburb, little micro sector. So they're making theatre or they're writing books or whatever it happens to be. And they get their idea of what the wider sector is like based on their own little particular experience of their own particular sector. Generally it doesn't scale up very well because there's so much diversity. But what does need to happen is that similar working conditions and similar precarity in some way need to be identified across different art forms. So the very obvious one in the pandemic was the need for venues for both theatre and live concert music. So they both use venues. And yet there was very little evidence that people in those two subsectors actually knew that they required the same capital resource. They didn't come together well. They didn't speak with a unified voice. It all got very muddled up in live performing Australia. It made me think, you haven't thought this through. You actually haven't worked out how, supply chains work and how, that kind of, what would we call it? Vertical integration, I suppose, actually happens across more than one art form, and therefore create a dialogue between, on the one hand, music producers and promoters, and on the other hand, theatre producers and theatre programmers. So that's one structural affinity, and I'm sure there are others that we could identify. And I think it might lead to some very interesting and very different policy conversations.
Yep. Thanks, Julian. Maggie, a comment? Do you have a comment? Justin, a comment from either of you? Maggie?
I mean, I think, thinking beyond the art sector as well to the whole precarious work situation now and casualisation, the gig economy. In the university sector, this is, a huge problem. And it's although artists are in a kind of unique space, they also have these affinities with other people in the gig economy who are living extremely hand to mouth with no job security, no financial security. So I think we need to also align this battle with the whole casualisation of work. And I am encouraged to see the ALP talking about secure work rather than merely the employment rate, which Anthony Albanese couldn't cite, but it's the quality of work and the working conditions are far more important really than whether or not you've got a 2-hour-a-week gig. So, yeah, I think we need to take it beyond the arts and culture sector and look for alliances with the union movement, for example, as well. Justin?
Well, when I was working with the foundational economy group, their idea, it's a pretty basic idea. There's no theoretical rocket science, but the idea of the economy as measured by GDP, etc., and growth. Actually, when you look at it realistically, you find that actually the social services, what they call the providential economy, and infrastructures, material infrastructures, utilities, fibre optics, transport, and small-scale local economies, all of those, in somewhere like South Australia, it makes up 70% of employment. So these are major sections of the economy, and yet they're seen as kind of peripheral. Oh, that's just taxpayers funded stuff. The real economy is this very small 30% area, which is high growth, highly extractive, etc. And yet here we are in a position where we talk, well, look, let's start investing in health and education. Let's start investing in infrastructure, all those kind of things. Even on the most pragmatic level, art and culture should say, well, we should be part of this. We should be part of rebuilding the social foundations. Why it thinks it should then align itself with a sliver of that activity in terms of high growth stuff and lots of young people with high oculars on and we're innovating, we're doing all this. No, you're not innovating actually. What most of art and culture is, it does innovate in its own terms, but what it is, it's part of that social service. The affinity we should seek is we should be sat at the table with health, with education, with those other social services, not as servicing them, arts as mental well-being or arts as economic growth or arts as its own thing. And what Julian had said this earlier, we've got to be clear about the value of art and culture, and they have their own distinct value. And nobody, our failure to talk about that value in its own terms, not of how it can service these other ones, the failure to talk about that value in its own terms has got us in a really difficult position. So the affinity is, how are we part of the social value? How are we part of the social whole that we want to foster and we need to foster if we're going to move forward? And that's a simple question, but it's a big thing. It's a
simple question with a big answer. And thank you. Well, look, we've run a little over our time, but I think what you've done is you've raised the issues very, very clearly, and we'll work through them and work with you, because through the Stretton Institute, we want to engage in the policy dialogue, seeing that other major public policy organisations don't see it as sufficiently important. And there are many issues about the way in which cultural policy and policy in the arts can be seen within our policy frameworks, not as often is the case, as an indulgence in our society. And we've got to move away from seeing it as an indulgence. We hope to be able to lay out a public agenda, facilitate some of the discussions about direction in public policy, and we hope that you will all join us in this endeavour. Please, if you'd like to receive more materials from the Stretton Institute, just send us a note and say add me to the mailing list, and we'll do that. And on that note, I'd like to thank our three speakers, Maggie, Julian and Justin, and also like to thank Anna Goldsworthy, who pulled it all together and made it all happen and wasn't able to participate today. So thanks, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you at future events.